Chapter 7, Lylan 12.7, March 28, 2311 AD. Emma had been fascinated by Daniel Dwyer all of her life, perhaps even more so after she had gained her second-hand sight. As the years passed and all of the possible futures furled down to one, she grew to love him. She was a virgin, had been all her life. There were no secrets from Emma, and there were few men with no secrets. The thought of being with any of them was sickening to her, except for Daniel. Only Daniel wasn't real. He wasn't flesh and blood. Like her, he was everyone. The two of them were everyone, but at different ends, linked by the present. He was different. He was selfless and kind. With nothing to gain for himself, he'd nurtured a once sick world into the paradise it had become. All of the offenses to nature that man had committed were being righted. All of the wounds he'd inflicted on the face of the earth mended. People no longer died because they couldn't afford medication or housing or food or warmth. Everyone on earth now had access to safe, clean water and nutritious, sustainable food sources. The world's energy sources were no longer an affront to her children. There had not been a single successful murder attempt in the last 250 years, nor in that time had a suicide been allowed to come to fruition, and war was a thing of the past. People seldom even died from accidents anymore, and when they did, it was only when they were very sudden. Daniel rescued people from slips and falls frequently, intervened to prevent all manner of accidents daily, and he tolerated no violence. He was the savior of the world, loved and revered the world over, and he relished their affections. For Daniel Dwyer was everyone. To love everyone was to love him. To honor everyone was to honor him. When one was kind to a stranger, they were also kind to Daniel Dwyer, and he would reward them in kind. It's little wonder that the established religions of centuries past would fade in his shadow. Once he'd eliminated the wanton corruption, and there was no more material gain to be had from religious worship of any kind anywhere, the old institutions simply crumbled, having evidently been held together by the web of greed alone. So here was Daniel, declared to be a god despite his quieted objections, worshipped with the fervor of the gods of old, and content to allow it, pleased to hear recitations of his credos. It was one of the more shameful things he stood guilty of: pride. To say that Emma was or was not religious is subjective. She shared experiences with everyone the world over and carried some of each of their perspectives with her. She was every hardened man of science and every religious fanatic in existence at once, not to mention herself, and so many more besides. She'd never set foot in a house of worship with worship on her mind, and yet she'd gone nearly every morning of her life since she was 10 years old to every church in the world, vicariously through the many patrons. She tried not to mull over the value of differing perspectives so much. It was so difficult to reconcile the degrees of varying logic at their cores. One's truth is one's truth. Fact was where people found common ground, the evidence of truth. Only then truth would change. Ignorance of facts is all that stands in the way of enlightenment by way of truth. The reason the populace did not stand together enlightened was because of the prevalent ignorance. Daniel could have easily forced education on the world, but he would not completely arrest its freedoms. It would spin as it would without him, only with him. He would not force the world to do anything but thrive physically. He was everyone, but he would not make everyone him. His people were free to choose, just not free to act in ways he condemned. The exhibit depicting the decline of government and religion was extensive, with over 40 articles of interest. Everything from the robbery note on the Vatican door to pictures of former religious leaders in photo ops with the spirit of Daniel Dwyer, commemorating the declaration that they themselves had converted to Dwyerism and encouraged their followers to follow suit. Even a gun that had been purchased by a devout Christian with the intent to murder one of the famous religious leaders who'd bid his flock follow him to the foot of Daniel Dwyer, only to be peacefully stopped by Daniel Dwyer, were on display. During unguided tours of the museum, a recording of someone reading the message of Daniel Dwyer would play on a loop through speakers accompanying the exhibit. This, of course, was the famous message that Daniel Dwyer delivered the world over in one day. The message conveyed to every sound-minded person on the planet the announcement of his awareness and his intentions. This had happened over 250 years ago. It was now ancient history. The curator recited it flawlessly without the need to reference any written account of the message, which was pretty impressive. He must have been working there for a long time. Rosa scanned the exhibit once more and took a long look at the statue of Daniel Dwyer depicted in his smooth-featured spirit form, holding a set of stylized newborns in his arms. Supposedly, the design of the statue was based on a real event when Daniel had saved a mother from dying in childbirth and rescued her twin babies. It was not accounted for in Hannah Dunn's memoirs, but there still existed a transcript of an old news interview. Official records to the incident were redacted and others missing. Supposedly, this woman, Gloria Smith, and her twins were the last people that Daniel saved just before his death in 2055. The 10-foot statue commemorated the moment well, as unrealistic and stylized as it was with its sharp angles and smooth curves, though the mother was not part of the sculpture. Emma always felt that the placement of the statue, which was not a historical piece, having been designed only 50 years ago or so, seemed odd. The rescue of the people had its own exhibit, which seemed to her the right place for the statue. It was eye-pleasing, but a little inappropriate, because the depiction of him saving lives had no place amid artifacts representing his abolition of government and the disintegration of religion. They were unrelated. It seemed to Emma, as she was the world's foremost reasonable person, that the placement of the statue in the exhibit was subliminal coercion to convert people to Dwyerism, and of course, she was right. "Anything else you want to last look at him?" Rosa asked, her eyes still locked on the statue, the out-of-place focal point of the exhibit. Emma shook her head and indicated that they could proceed. They declined the curator's offer to answer any questions they might have, then followed him to the next exhibit. As they carried on, out of the corner of Rosa's eye, Emma caught sight of the looming form of Mr. Red in the display down the hall, from the exhibit depicting the death of Daniel Dwyer. Macabre as it was, this was her favorite exhibit. She was fascinated by the events surrounding his death, and was already disappointed that she'd be right in front of it momentarily, and yet only as close as she'd ever been. Being here was really starting to make her hate being her, to hate being blind. Still, it was the last exhibit on the tour before the commencement of the blessing ceremonies. She kinda couldn't wait to get there, and she'd happily hear the story of his death once more. It was a very interesting day in history. Daniel Dwyer 7, April 1st, 2024 AD. If there was one thing that Daniel did well, it was follow instructions. Only it was always very apparent to the instructor that their commands were being translated to Daniel via a medium, his 8-ball. Take away the 8-ball, and not only would he fail to follow prior commands, he would also be unreceptive to new instruction. Additionally, it would seem that return of the 8-ball to Daniel's possession would negate any specific prior instruction beyond that which comprised his daily routine. Dr. Foster had learned all of this while working with Daniel at the asylum. Why then he was having such difficulty integrating new instructions to Daniel with regard to his extra bodily excursions was an endless source of frustration for the good doctor. He had tracked all of his attempts at communication with Daniel the need to prevent attacks and crimes and not simply intervene when a life was threatened. His attempts to convince Daniel to become proactive seemed to fall on deaf ears. It seemed that he could be led as a lamb while he woke, but could not be swayed from his ways in his sleep. He had tried everything. Nothing seemed to work. He had file and file of recorded attempts employing various methods of providing instruction, but also subsequent analysis which yielded only disappointing results. Then he got lucky, if you can call what happened to him lucky. Dr. Foster went through his nightly routine, uploading the day's data on Daniel, emptying his shot glass a few times, and checking the various websites that were unknowingly dedicated to sightings of his patient. The account of the rape and rescue of Ana Hernandez was posted on Is the Shadow Man Real, which was by far the most reputable of the websites, within 4 days of the attack. Afterward, the good doctor was recorded to have focused largely on trying to communicate to Daniel the need to prevent rape, not only murder, but it didn't seem to work. Many accounts of survivors believed to have been saved by the Shadow Man in subsequent months revealed that many women among them had been repeatedly raped before finally being rescued and avenged by Daniel, and only just prior to their imminent death in nearly every account, all but those not facing their attacker, who instead named Thin Air as their rescuer, which would rightly have been attributed to the spirit if witnessed. The man with the 8-ball was listening, but did not hear. Every day the good doctor would attempt to communicate with Daniel, to try and reach him beyond eliciting reactions to simple commands, something that might get through to him on a deeper level so that his instruction may carry over from Daniel's waking mind to that of when he was projecting his spirit outside of his body. Every day he tried, and no proof of progress ever surfaced in the stories about Daniel. It seemed that Daniel would only intervene on behalf of those that for which certain death was imminent, and if and when the averted death was a prevented murder, he would kill the aggressor every time. Knowingly harboring a vigilante was not the sort of thing that Dr. Foster ever envisioned himself doing. He had college degrees that he never even used. He was a highly educated man of science, not superstitious in the least. Patrick Foster, even since early childhood, was a non-believer. Calling him a skeptic would have been downplaying his stubborn, closed-mind perspective. He knew he didn't know everything, but he thought he knew what he knew about everything at least well enough to know that he could reasonably conclude that what he suspected Daniel was doing in his sleep was utterly impossible. He had no tangible proof of any out-of-body excursions on the part of his sleeping patient, but as if the stories of those who'd seen the spirit having so often described it as holding a round object in its right hand weren't enough to make the connection, the timing of any alleged daytime interactions with the spirit seemed to always correspond with Daniel's bouts of sudden daytime naps that from which he could not be awakened. He hadn't suspected any of this until he heard about what had happened to the orderly who had been killed in Daniel's cell, Eric Stanley. He, the non-believer, in that moment had somehow intuitively concluded that Daniel had killed him in his sleep and had done so without touching him. Then, the coroner determined that the mechanism of injury had been identified as a hard spherical object roughly the size of Daniel's 8-ball. Additionally, surveillance footage from the asylum showed that no one had followed him into Daniel's room. All that could be seen on the recording was grainy footage of the orderly entering the room and closing the door. Then a few minutes later, a pool of blood began slowly spreading into the hallway from under the base of the door. A few minutes after that, a passing nurse saw the blood and looked inside the window of the cell. Security showed up and a lot of commotion ensued. Daniel would not wake up despite the havoc in his cell. It was not time for him to wake up yet, so he stayed asleep as he always did until 5 o'clock the next morning. Then he awoke with no aid, precisely at 5, just like always. He was in the possession of police detectives, and his 8-ball had been taken away. So, in lieu of his ball, he incessantly stared at the palm of his right hand. Dr. Foster filed a grievance with the court demanding that the 8-ball be returned immediately after being examined, as his patient's well-being was contingent on use of the 8-ball. With the amount of documentation he submitted as evidence to support this claim, the judge was easily convinced and gave the order to have the forensic examination performed as soon as possible and for the toy to be returned to the asylum staff post haste. Daniel still had to suffer catheterization and tube feeding for 2.5 weeks, but his 8-ball was returned to him as ordered. That was 5 years ago. Daniel Dwyer lived comfortably with Dr. Foster, and ate well, and made use of quality hygiene products, but not much else. Daniel did as he was told, and he took care of his own needs with regard to bathing, eating, and sleeping, but he did little besides. He looked into his 8-ball, and that was his life. Gaze, act, pause, wash, rinse, repeat. Daniel Dwyer was everyone and no one. Dr. Foster continued to work at the asylum, and Daniel spent 5 days a week alone in the doctor's house where he was under constant video surveillance. His 8-ball never failed to instruct him properly when to use the bathroom, when and what to eat, and the doctor even put him on an exercise regimen which he followed to the T. The doctor had him under surveillance at all times, and had logs of incidences of observed occurrences of sudden daytime sleeping. The logs through the years would often later be described to correspond with many eyewitness accounts of the vengeful black spirit the internet had dubbed the Shadow Man. The reason the press would run away with the name Mr. 8 in the coming time was because of who they happened to get a hold of first. When Daniel's identity was revealed to the world, one of his caretakers from the asylum was interviewed, and the nickname given to him by the patients, Mr. 8, stuck. However, in the ledger column of Dr. Foster's logbooks from this era, it says Shadow Man across the top of the second column, not Mr. 8, while the first column was labeled Daniel. The Daniel column was filled with dates and times that he slept, with stars scribbled next to any spontaneous daytime sleep incidences, and the Shadow Man column had data written in for any accounts of sightings. Throughout the whole of the logs, data were recorded for roughly 1 in 12 of those daytime incidences of sleep. The doctor had enough evidence to satisfy himself at this point that Daniel was indeed exiting his body somehow as he slept and practicing vigilantism without the use of his body. His logs revealed that there was a clear corroboration between Daniel's fits of sleep and the appearance of the Shadow Man. His intuition had been correct, and he was very happy with the secret work with Daniel, but the non-believer still, in his heart, remained skeptical. He had never seen the disembodied spirit of Daniel Dwyer in person, and in 2024, no photographs or video footage of his spirit form had yet surfaced, if any existed at all. So, even though the evidence was splayed out in front of him, screaming the truth, the doctor reserved his judgment. He simply recorded the facts. In his heart, he believed in the phenomenon of Daniel Dwyer, but as was so often the case for him, his heart and his head were in disagreement. For someone such as him, only seeing is believing. There was an abrupt distinction in the way the journals, notes, and logs of Dr. Foster were written before the 1st of April of that year and the way they were written after. His perspective changed that day. That was the day he was forcibly transmuted from a non-believer to a skeptic, demoted from a sane, grounded world to a new, unfamiliar one from which he did not know what to expect. He would see the impossible, and know then and there that all of those framed degrees on display in his office didn't amount to jack shit, because he realized that he didn't know anything for certain, and that he'd only assumed before to know anything at all, and that this is the experience of all who reason. Once one sees the impossible, all things certain become only probable. The doctor had tried all kinds of clever ways to communicate with him. The creativity of the methods of his failed attempts was exemplary of his cleverness, and only became more and more exploratory after they'd begun living in the same home. Still, the communication breakthrough he was striving for just never happened. He was starting to run out of ideas. Today he had tried again for the 100th time the small mirror he had fashioned to fit the 8-ball's viewing window, this time backlit by blue light. He had attempted this same method several times before. All of his attempts had seemed to fail, but he would still recycle those ideas he thought may have merit. With the little mirror fixed to the toy's viewing window, the doctor would position himself at such an angle that Daniel would be looking at a reflection of him when he went to check the 8-ball. Then the doctor would recite his message to Daniel and repeat it twice, then wait for a response. Every time this experiment was performed, Daniel would only stare into the mirror facing the doctor and never move, never blink, never react. Dr. Foster had even tried angling the mirror so that Daniel would see his own reflection, but it was met with the same flat affect. Daniel would just stay fixed, looking into the mirror where the window ought to be, unmoving. Still, every day the good doctor tried to deliver his message in one way or another. Killing is a terrible crime, and to prevent a killing is just, and in most every case very deserving of your time. But you must consider other crimes against innocent people that can be prevented altogether. Daniel, if you see that someone is going to be raped or hurt or molested or robbed, these two you must prevent. Daniel, do not kill anyone that does not pose a threat to other people at large. Do not kill anyone you don't feel you have to, but kill all that you must. Daniel, Save the world from more than just death. Save it from pain and anguish. Daniel, you can do it," said the good doctor, looking into Daniel's far-flung eyes through the little mirror on the 8-ball bathed in blue light, and said it again, then again. No response. There was never any response. This soliloquy had started off as the recitation of simple instructions. Daniel, prevent rape, molestation, robbery, and murder. Daniel, prevent people from being hurt, etc. His message to Daniel had become refined over time, and he quite liked its current iteration. He said it so often that it was sewn into his memory, and he didn't modify it much anymore. As he was looking through the stories on Does the Shadow Man Exist, a new article uploaded just that instant popped up. It was the survival story of one Hannah Dunn, a red-headed knockout if her picture didn't lie. It seemed she had just been saved by the Shadow Man 6 days ago. He read the article and found the date in his logbook. The incident had happened at night, so it wasn't one of the standouts with the star next to it, but he made his entry in the book. He recorded only the facts: her name, a few words related to the incident, summarizing with little detail. Next to the corresponding date, he wrote Hannah Dunn, attempted rape and murder, assailant dead, no rape. And then he wrote a question mark in the column. It must have been that whoever was attacking her was intent on murdering her from the start. Most of the time, Daniel did not prevent rape from occurring. After he'd finished his log entry, he went back to reading the article. He didn't notice that a dark figure had appeared behind him in the shadows. The shadow just stood there watching him, chest heaving up and down as it breathed. It looked as though there was something in its right hand from the way the arm was positioned, but that which it held was indiscernible, concealed behind the hip and leg. He had to piss. He got up and took a few steps, and then he saw the form just standing there. He lost his breath in an involuntary gasp and jumped back a little bit. Then, a bit amazed, said, "Daniel, is that you?" He knew Daniel to be asleep in a room down the hall, and yet he could not deny what he was seeing. But then the good doctor had a very clear reminder of the fact that he knew nothing when the figure raised its right arm, but in place of a magic 8-ball, there was a knife. Then the junkie who had broken into his house leaned into the light and said, "Where the fuck is your money?" The doctor didn't know what to do. His gut reaction was to go for his phone, so he did. But when the crazed knife-wielding drug addict saw him with his phone in his hand, he came charging at the doctor. He was running fast at him, with drug-induced vigor, and accelerated very quickly considering there was only about 20 or so feet to cover. He ran so fast toward him that when Daniel Dwyer's spirit appeared between them and brought him to a sudden stop, grabbing him by the throat and immediately arresting his forward movement, not only did it break his neck like a toothpick, but the shoes came flying off of his feet toward the doctor and some change flew out of one of his pockets. He'd managed to hold on to the knife for the duration of those few fractions of a second before he went limp from his severed spinal cord. Then he released his grip and the knife fell to the floor. Then his head flopped over in a very unnatural position, as if it were connected to his body by only a worn-out thread. The tongue flopped out of his mouth, and the light left his eyes. The spirit stood motionless for a moment, effortlessly holding the dead weight of the malodorous junkie in his outstretched arm, his back to the doctor. Then the spirit began the all-too-familiar bending of his right arm, and Dr. Foster knew that he was about to look into his 8-ball and disappear. So before he could gaze into his 8-ball, the good doctor said, "Daniel, wait, stay there." The doctor's heart was pounding in his chest. The rhythmic timing of it could be heard when he spoke, and it made his breathing uneven, but he tried to remain calm. The spirit consulted the ball, then simply let his arm come to rest at his side and stood there holding the lifeless corpse, its head dangling, tiptoes of its feet grazing the floor. Dr. Foster slid his phone back into his pocket with a nervous, shaking hand, swallowed hard, and then he said, "Daniel, look at me." It was only a few seconds until the shadowy silhouette consulted the ball again, but it seemed like an eternity to the doctor. The form did not disappear. It turned around to face the doctor, the corpse dangling from its hand like the pendulum of some morbid grandfather clock, drops of blood starting to fall from its mouth onto the wood panel floor, creating the beginnings of a flower-like pattern in little drops of dark red as the corpse swung about. This was huge progress. Daniel had never made eye contact with the doctor before, and though his eyes could not be seen, It seemed that he was looking at him now for the first time. Dr. Foster stifled a would-be gasp. "You can put him down, Daniel," the doctor said, and waited. "Come on, gaze, act, and pause." Daniel did not place the body on the floor. He simply released his grip, and the body fell like a stone into a pile of contorted limbs in between Daniel and the doctor. The doctor couldn't help but to think of the cat he used to have and when it would deposit the corpses of dead animals on his kitchen floor. He knew that Daniel seemed to have no desire for companionship, let alone approval, but couldn't help but in some way, if only for the sake of hope, think of this as an offering. "My God," the doctor said, realizing that his chance had come at last to communicate the message he had day in and day out failed to convey. "Daniel, listen to me.